In this video, we're going to cover the pad mode and its controls. The pad mode is a MIDI mapping mode that enables you to trigger drum samples. So the pad mode is used to trigger individual samples, with each of the pads sending an individual note message to the software. The behavior of the pads can be controlled by the quick setup menu as discussed in the previous video. The pad mode is also available outside of Studio One, so if you connect the controller to another digital audio workstation, this mapping mode is also available when you're not using the Studio One software, which we'll show in later videos when we're talking about using the Atom with other digital audio workstations. So to demo the pads today, I have an instance of Impact XT drum sampler loaded up, with a simple kick, snare, and hi-hat loaded in. You can also see the pads that have samples loaded up, pads 1, 2, and 3, are illuminated with a color on the controller, which is the Impact XT drum machine saying that there's a sample loaded into that pad. The first mode that I want to cover is the full level mode. When engaged, every pad will trigger its assigned sound at the full strike velocity of 127, no matter how soft or how hard you hit that pad. So to enable this, we can go over and just press the full level button on the left hand side. And then now whenever I press my snare drum sound really softly, it triggers at a really loud volume, or I can press it really hard, and it triggers at the exact same volume, because we've locked the velocity on the controller to play back everything at the same velocity. If this was disabled, and I was to press the pad really softly, it plays a softer sound, or if I was to press it really hard, it plays a much louder sound. Depending on what you're doing, the full level control may be helpful. I find that this is most helpful if I'm performing, and I want to make sure that I trigger all of my samples and don't accidentally hit something too soft, or accidentally miss a sample because I don't trigger it loud enough. Or if I'm composing a part and I don't need to worry about the velocity on the pads, I just want to make sure I'm triggering the proper drum sounds. The next control on the pad mode is the note repeat control. The note repeat control allows you to repeatedly trigger a sound at a specified rate for as long as you hold down the pad. This is great for creating things like hi-hat patterns or fast snare rolls or things like that. To select a pad for the note repeat in Studio One, you can first press the pad that you'd like to repeat. So let's go ahead and do the snare sound. And then you want to go ahead and enable the note repeat by pressing it on the left-hand side. And you'll see that the pads have now illuminated yellow, telling you that you're in the note repeat mode. Then you could just enable the note repeat at the speed you want by pressing the corresponding pad. So if we wanted a 16th note snare roll, we could just press the 16th note button, as shown on the smaller text here. Or we could do an 8th note snare roll. Or we can even do triplets as well. So 30-second note triplets. So something really fast or something a bit slower like 8th note triplets. If you want to select a different sample for the note repeat, what you can do is press and hold the select button and then select the desired pad that you want. And then now the new sample will be selected and applied to the note repeat. So press the select button, we could press the hi-hat sample. And then we can go back to our note repeat mode and we could press the 8th note, for example. And we now have the new sample applied to the note repeat. Now with that out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about the different pad banks on the controller. So we can go ahead and turn off the note repeat mode, so we're back on our main mode. The pad banks are used to store different drum samples in the pads for a total of 128 different sounds. The banks on the Atom correspond to the different pad banks inside of the Impact XT drum machine in Studio One. The bank button allows you to switch between these different pad banks 1 through 8, which you could see illuminated on these different pads here. So to show what this is doing, let's go ahead and move back over to our instance of Impact XT. So make sure to press the Show Hide button if you haven't already, so it pops up in the software. And then if we look at the left-hand side of the instrument, you can see that we're currently in Pad Bank A. And that's the pad bank with the kick, snare, and hi-hat. And we can select a different pad bank on the Impact XT. So let's go ahead and swap over to Pad Bank B, which we can do by pressing the second pad. And you can see in the software, we've now switched over to Pad Bank B, and we now have these new samples that we can trigger on our controller. So instead of triggering the kick and snare, we now have these two new percussion sounds. You can also swap between the different pad banks by selecting the different banks in the software on the Impact XT. So if I want to switch over to Pad Bank C, I could just press on that, and it swaps over to the different pad bank, which you can see reflected on the controller as well. Or we could swap back over to Pad Bank A, and you can see that we now have this kick, snare, and hi-hat samples that are now playable from our Atom controller. And by using this selection process, we could select any of the pad banks on the Atom. So this just enables you to load lots of different samples onto a single instance of an Impact XT drum machine, which is great when you're working on your projects and you want to try out different drum kits or different samples. So that's all for this video looking at the pad controls. In future videos, we'll talk in depth about sequencing drum patterns from the pads on the Atom. I just first wanted to cover the basics of the pad mode of the controller before we move forward into more complicated drum machine programming. Thanks, and I will see you in future videos.